Hey, James McWilliams, man, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, John. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I appreciate you. I think you're pretty sure you are my first repeat guest on this particular podcast, so I appreciate that very much.
No, it's a huge honor.
And we're here to talk about your new book that will be released within a day or two after this goes live. And definitely want to talk about that book about Frank Stanford. Before we do get into that, even though you have been a guest before, tell our listeners who you are, what you do, what you're up to.
Yeah, I'm James McWilliams, and I'm a historian at Texas State University, where I've been teaching since 1999. And I've written about a wide variety of subjects. My career was sort of hijacked by journalism for about 10 years, and I've spent the last 8 years researching and writing this biography of Frank Stanford, which I kind of fell into unexpectedly, but it's been an all-consuming experience.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a lot about that. But before we do, you're up to a couple of other things now. I mean, the way publishing world works, you've been done with this book for a little while, and
Yeah,
our last or the first episode you did with me was on Everett Maddox, and you are now writing a book about Everett Maddox. Is that right? Is it a book project or what is
that's
it?
correct. I seem to be drawn to increasingly obscure, troubled, drunken Southern poets that very few people have heard of. But I would say Maddox is much like Stanford in that when people discover that poetry, it's a real awakening for them. These are voices that got lost. And there's something about the South, I think, in particular, that makes that easier to happen. If you're swirling around the commercial publishing venues and literary parties of New York, that's one thing. But, if you're working in obscurity in some bar in New Orleans, or in Stanford's case, the hills of Northwest Arkansas, it's very easy to do this incredible work and really for it to go undiscovered. And so what draws me to these poets, I think, is the experience of ushering this really powerful poetry to a wider audience. I mean, both poets have their cult followers, but
Yeah.
that's not necessarily who I'm trying to reach with these projects. Yeah.
I wonder. I wonder if this was a phenomenon of the past in the sense that yes, it's probably easy for people like Maddox and Stanford to go unnoticed at the time because they weren't in New York and weren't running in those circles. But now with the internet and with just so easy to discover people, I wonder if there probably are still some kind of cult figures that are relatively unknown, but I would think less so. Any thoughts on
I
that?
think that's especially true for Stanford. I mean, I think Stanford's stock has really risen with the emergence of digital information and the speed with which it can be shared. But and I think it has sort of expanded his base significantly. Maddox is curious to me though, because if you go looking for a Maddox poem online, there's a very small chance you'll find it, which is really odd because this is a guy who published in the Paris Review and the New Yorker, at a young age, but went on to produce hundreds of poems in 4 books. And there's a number of occasions where I want to send somebody a Maddox poem, and I go online to look for it, and it's not there. And so I end up taking a photograph of, my hard copy of a book of his poems and send it that way. So I think, Maddox has not benefited as much from an online discourse the way Stanford was. And I don't purport to have any idea why that would be the case, but that's definitely my observation there.
Mhm. Well, maybe that'll change a little bit when you publish your book. Uh, Two other questions I have for you before we get into the Stanford project. One, it's a little unusual, at least for the guests that I typically have on this podcast, that you yourself do not write poetry, or very little if you do. And I know you're a historian and you're a professor and you're pretty busy doing all that. I'm just curious though, is it something you've thought about? What's your stock answer to someone says you're clearly a scholar of poetry and very interested in poetry? Why don't you write poetry?
Well, first of all, I do, but I'm not going to ever allow anybody to see it.
Ah,
There's a
okay.
little file somewhere on my computer where
Okay.
you can find it. But and I think one of the reasons why I ventured into trying it about 10 years ago was I wanted to develop an appreciation for how difficult it was to do it well. And I never felt like I could do it well. And in some ways, this was humbling and heightened my respect for the poets that I study. But I also think that my own mind is more geared towards analysis than creating poetry from scratch. I'm much better at sort of taking what's been done and thinking it through. And I can think about it like as a new historicist, or as a new critic, I like that versatility. But when it comes to actually producing the poetry, I find myself just repeatedly disappointed with what I produced. Whereas if I sit down and write a paragraph, I can go, oh yeah, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is probably too easy of an answer, but I do think poetry in particular among the arts is one of those things that it's something that you're really driven to do or you're not going to do it.
I think that's true. Yeah. And it's just so I've never actually tried something where for me, it's impossible not to read it and cringe. It's an art form where it's so easy to be cliched. It's so easy
Yeah.
to be derivative. And
Yeah. Yeah. And
I have, I don't like feeling that way. When I write something and read it, it doesn't make me feel good to say, oh, that's
yeah.
actually really cliched and cringy.
Yeah. And then what happens, at least with me, and I know some other people too, then what happens is you purposely obfuscate it because you don't want it to sound cliche or have too easy of a meaning. And that can work out, but it also can just be sort of nonsense as well.
Well, then you're in your head too. Like you're in your head thinking about how am I writing a poem, which is, I think, a terrible way to probably write a poem. I mean, the things that most poets that I've talked to about their process say is they're writing a poem when they don't know they're writing a poem. And that's in some ways the magic that you're talking about and the gift that you either have or you don't have. And I'm pretty certain I don't have it.
And I'll tell you the best stuff that I've produced. I know I'm writing a poem, but I have no clue where it's going. I have
Yeah.
no clue what the ending is going to be, and I surprise myself, and
Yeah.
that always ends up being best. And I've said this on this podcast before, but I'm really fascinated by the difference between poetry and songwriting as a songwriter. For me, songwriting is so much more difficult
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
it's the same problems you have with poetry, coupled with the fact that every syllable has to fit the melody, like a
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
like
So
something.
while I have tried poetry writing on my own, there is no evidence of me ever trying to write a song. I'm happy
Okay.
to say. Yeah.
Okay, the other thing I wanted to ask you about was, or I wanted you to sort of plug, is your really fascinating, wonderful Substack project. Tell people what that's all about.
So the Substack is called Poetry, Ink, Letters, and Love, and I've been a lifelong letter writer, and I have been increasingly disenchanted with the way that we communicate as human beings with each other. A lot of this is super convenient and functional, but we've gotten over reliant, I think, on texting and Instagram video, TikTok videos and Instagram posts. And I mean, I'm not a Luddite. I see the point of these forms of communication, but I think it's easy to lose touch with a slower and more thoughtful form, a more tactile form of communication. And I was actually lamenting this with my daughter, who's 21, and she said, "Hey, you should start a Substack and just record yourself writing letters because you write these thoughtful letters to people. I write them to my kids all the time, and I tried it, and it really was satisfying. It felt like a natural thing to do. And so once every 2 weeks, I'll record myself writing a letter. But before I do that, I talk a little bit about the stationery I'm using, the ink that I'm using, and then I read a poem, because in some ways I think that might be, to answer your question, do I write poetry? No, but I write those letters, and those letters are maybe my version of, what a poet might do. So
Mhm.
I've really I've been surprised by how much I've enjoyed making those little videos.
Well, I've really enjoyed them as well, and I encourage people to check it out. It's very different. There's no, I don't think I've seen anything quite like it, and that's one of the things I applaud you for. You're adding something to the cacophony of voices out there that is pretty unique, and that's hard to do, and it's well done.
Thank
Um,
you.
so, as a fan of letters, when you look at someone like Frank Stanford or Everett Maddox, do you search out their letters, their correspondence, and does that feed into
Well, okay,
the
so
project?
Let's talk about Stanford with this. I
Yeah.
mean, so Stanford was a truly prolific letter writer. I mean, he tended to be more or less, yeah, obsessive about everything that he did, and letter writing would fall under that obsessive category. The reason why it took me so long to write this book was I had to build the archive. I had to track down a lot of letters, and I certainly had help doing that. There's a couple of other scholars out there who are interested in Stanford and helped me find these letters. But Yale has an archive, and there are some letters of Frank Stanford's in that archive, but the vast majority of letters that Frank had written are not archived. And so reaching out to publishers that he worked with, and journals that he published with, and lovers that he had, and friends that he had, led to an accumulation of literally hundreds of letters. And those are an art form in and of
Yeah.
themselves. He wrote in ink. He wrote in pencil. He wrote in blood. He actually wrote one letter, we think, in his own blood. He was an intense cat, Frank Stanford, and that intensity comes through in the letters. And early on, his letters are full of fire. But one of the sadder aspects of my research was towards the end of his life, when he started a press. He ran a business, Lost Roads Publications, and he started to write business letters. And it was really terribly sad to watch these letters go from being open and on fire to being closed and business-like. And you could kind of feel his soul sort of deflate as he was in the position of having to sit down and write a letter that was all business.
Was this very late in his life?
Yeah, so it was really the last 2 years of his life where he was actively running the press and, corresponding with poets that he was working with and photographers that he was working with. And, you just got the sense that this was a man who's was not supposed to be contained that way. And so the letters really reflect that. But early on, particularly when he's in crisis, God, I've never seen anybody be able to convey the intensity of their emotion to a letter like he could.
Mhm.
And so that was a really fascinating, gratifying part of the research, was discovering and analyzing these letters. And they drive the book. I mean, the biography is driven by these letters.
Do you have an advanced copy you can show us?
Not, I do, but it's not, I don't have it. I should have had it right in front of me.
Okay, it's okay. It'll be
It's
released.
here. It's in the house that I'm in, but it's not with me right now.
Yeah. Well, people can pre-order. I've got
You-
my copy's pre-ordered,
Okay.
and so people can go ahead and pre-order it now. You don't have to wait until July 1st. Though, as I said,
Thank you.
this will be released a day or two before. You're also have you finished the project of editing his little short poem, the battlefield where the
Possibly
moon.
the longest poem published in American history. Yeah, let me say a little bit about that. So, I mean, Stanford's defining work was a poem called "The Battlefield Where the Moon Says I Love You." He worked on it more than half of his life, and the first edition was published in 1977. They only had a run of about 1,000 copies. Many of those were destroyed in a flood. The rest of them are just they're rarities. Unless you've got $2,000 to $3,000 sitting around, you're not going to get your hands on one of those copies. And if you do, it will probably fall apart the minute you turn the page. And so a second edition came out in 2000, published by Lost Roads, actually, Frank's Press. That went out of print last year. And so I've been busy over the last year editing and I'm doing this with another scholar named Adam Walton, and we co-edited the poem, and we'll be putting it out next year with the University of Arkansas Press, but it'll be with an introduction. I wrote summaries of the scenes in the battlefield to help first-time readers through what can be a somewhat obscure text, and we wrote a little history of the poem itself, and we also found over 1,000 mistakes between the first edition and the second edition and corrected those. So it's a definitive third edition of the Battlefield, which will be out next year with the University of Arkansas Press. I appreciate you bringing that up.
Beautiful. And how many lines is that poem?
It used to be 15,283. Now I think it's 15,423 or 32 or something.
My God.
Yeah.
Well, as anyone who's been listening to this podcast has figured out, this episode is a little different. Normally, we just look at one poem by one poet, and we do want to look at a couple of Frank's poems. But the main point of this particular episode is to celebrate you and the fact that you've got this book coming out that I'm really looking forward to. Tell us maybe, are there any particularly poignant stories about what this 10-year-long journey has been like for you trying to write this book?
Where to begin? I interviewed over 200 people, and so you can imagine there's just all these interviews sort of have their own story. I'll plug an article that I wrote for the Oxford American in fall 2024 that describes an interview that I did with the writer Ellen Gilchrist, who was in her mid 80s when I tracked her down in Ocean Spring, Mississippi. The vast majority of my interviews were hugely successful, but I learned a few things doing these interviews. One was people will spill their guts after 2 glasses of wine. Almost every single person I interviewed over alcohol said a lot more than people who didn't drink alcohol. Another thing I learned is that doing group interviews, if you can pull it off, if you can get a group of people together to talk about what you're researching, people are less inhibited. They're less fearful of being the kind of sole provider of this information. And when it's a group effort, you kind of get more. And so one afternoon in New Orleans, I got 5 people together who knew Stanford pretty well, bought a bunch of beer, got a bunch of gumbo, and we sat in this big room in a rented Airbnb. And 8 hours later, I had more information than I'd ever imagined. I had to, and I won't mention this person by name, but one of the people who had a great deal of Stanford material was a hoarder. And I'm not talking like had hoarding tendencies, was a true hoarder. And I had to spend days going through this person's house, finding little Stanford gems. Came up short on a number of occasions. I mean, in some ways, you know how in science, it's really the failures that are as important as the successes. And we know very well that Stanford and the poet Tom Lux had a huge correspondence, but Tom Lux said he lost that folder of letters. Well, Tom Lux died in 2000, I think 16 or 17, and his wife, who lives in Atlanta, had an attic full of his material. So I spent a couple days diving through her attic and found nothing after 2 days. Got several good margaritas out of the deal, though, so it was okay. And my favorite failure is a guy who knew Frank very well in Fayetteville during his college years named Fred McQuistion. And he went by Bad Fred. And Frank and Fred got in a great deal of trouble, but Fred had dementia. I was in touch with his girlfriend, and his girlfriend, who was 82, said that he had his good days and she would call me when he was in, having a good day. He's in Little Rock. And I happened to be in Dallas when she called and said, "Hey, Fred's in good spirits. I think you should come see him if you can." And it's about a 5-hour drive between Dallas and Little Rock. So I hopped in my car and I went. And I got there and I met the girlfriend and she took me into Fred. He was in a nursing home, and Fred took one look at me when I walked in. I explained who I was and what I wanted to do, and he took one look at me and he said, "Go away."
Oh, wow.
All right. Interview over. Yeah. So got back in the car and drove back to Dallas. So there was a
10
lot of
hours
that.
you'll
But
never get back, but
COVID also was a challenge. And so I think the other really memorable and kind of, I have a real fond memory of this is, Frank went to Subiaco boarding school run by Benedictine monks in Northwest Arkansas. And the Subiaco newspaper is just, it was not online at the time. It was just in hard print. And so it was COVID, and I drove up, and the priest left on a bench outside of a building all these copies of the Subiaco newspaper. I took them, I checked myself into like a $25 a night motel nearby in Paris, Arkansas, and spent 12 hours going through the run of the Subiaco newspapers during Frank's years, and brought them back, left them on the bench, and went on my way. So there was a lot of that.
so he was a really fascinating guy, and there's you could tell stories after stories, and you do, I'm sure, in the biography. We don't obviously have time to do that now, but let me ask you about one thing, and because I think there's some controversy about it.
Yeah.
Uh, Lucinda Williams and Tom Waits, as I understand it, both have mentioned Frank as being their favorite poets, which says a whole lot to me, and I know
It does.
well to a
Yeah.
lot of people who I know. Um, and Lucinda has in her memoir has an account of Frank's death. Why don't you tell, if you can tell the story
Yeah.
of
Of the
his
suicide?
suicide? Yeah, and the interesting, fascinating dynamic of the two women involved and what happened that day.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is actually, I opened my book with the suicide because I don't want the whole book to be perceived as explaining the suicide, but this was obviously a critical moment in his life. And it's the moment that people kind of most know Frank Stanford for. So he was married to Ginny Crouch Stanford, who was a painter. Married her in 1974, October of 1974. A year later, he fell in love with C.D. Wright, who was just starting her poetry career at the University of Arkansas. And Frank and C.D. started to press together Lost Roads. So for a few years, Frank had essentially a kind of double life going on. And this wasn't the first time he had done this, actually. But what was different this time is he fell in love with both women. Now, Jenny, his wife, moved to Liberal, Missouri, where she had inherited a house from her grandparents, a grand house on a large farm. And so she's up in Missouri, CD's in Fayetteville, and Frank really was going back and forth for a couple of years. And over the course of this,
The women did not know about each other.
no, they did not know about each other. He kept it a secret. Everybody else seemed to know. I mean, this is like one of those mysteries to me, but they seem to not have known, or at least didn't want to know, and maybe knew subconsciously.
Well, again, pre-internet, pre-social
I
media,
know exactly. You could
pre-communication
keep
was
those
much
kind of
different. Yeah,
you
yeah.
could keep those kind of secrets back then for sure. And anyway, in May of 1978, Frank went to New Orleans. He had a 2-week trip planned to New Orleans, and he was going there to work with Ellen Gilchrist on a manuscript that he was publishing of hers. He also went to work with the Barataria Review, which is a journal that he was printing with his printing company. And he actually met Everett Maddox on that trip to New Orleans as well. But before he left, he seems to have left some love letters out from CD for Jenny to discover. He wanted to kind of come clean, but in a elliptical way. He was non-confrontational. He didn't want to do it directly. So he left. Jenny discovered the letters. Jenny and CD found each other. They, obviously compared 2 years of notes. And they were furious. I mean, their anger was understandably deeply intense. And there was a number of phone calls back and forth. Frank delayed coming back a few days, but on the morning of June 3rd, 1978, he woke up in Ralph Adamo's house in New Orleans, went and had breakfast with Ellen Gilchrist, got a ride to the airport by another lover named Kay Duvernay, and he flew home. And his friend Sherman picked him up, took him to his house at 705 Jackson Street in Fayetteville, where he lived with CD running the press. Jenny was there. They had a fight. The fight lasted hours. Frank said he needed to go to work to check on some paperwork that had built up. He worked as a surveyor. You need to go to a surveying office. They went to the office. He came out oddly wearing a red hoodie. It was warm out, got in the truck, went back to the house. They argued some more. Frank said he said he needed to lay down. He went into the bedroom and he shot himself 3 times in the chest with a 22 revolver. And so he died within minutes. And yeah, that was the tragic end of his life.
How does one shoot oneself 3 times in the chest? One would think one time would leave you immobilized.
So again, I'm not like a weapons expert, but my understanding is a 22 revolver is a bit like a heavy pellet gun, and so it's not as if the first shot went through him and killed him. These bullets kind of bounced around his chest and hit arteries and killed him. And so I mean, it's a surprising story and it seems impossible, but Frank was a myth. He was really like, there are just mythological characters, and he was really he lived a kind of mythological life in many ways, right up until the end. And I mean, it's important to note that he had been telegraphing this for a very long time. If you read The Battlefield carefully enough, you'll see a number of intimations towards suicide. In some cases, even the kind of suicide that he undertook. There's a line in The Battlefield, I think it goes, one would think 3 shots were fired, and there's enough, and there's a lot there. And I'm not suggesting that you should read The Battlefield necessarily looking for these hints, but they are there. And yeah, so I mean, it was a tragic end to a really life that was fully lived.
Yeah. And young, 29, is that right?
He was 29.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there's so many more stories we could tell, but read the book, folks. Read the book, and
It's all there. Yeah, I mean, it's because this was the first biography. It's a little longer than I wanted it to be, but I just felt like I had to put it all out there.
How many pages?
I mean, with the notes and acknowledgments and index, it's close to 700 pages, but it's about 500 and something pages of reading, text. Yeah.
Well, let's wind down by looking at a few of his poems.
For sure. Yeah.
And you chose 3 really good ones. Yeah, would you read The Blood Brothers for us? This is an early one, I believe.
This is his first poem published in his first book, The Singing Knives. This was published, the copyright's 1971. It came out in the summer of 1972. I mean, just a little bit of background. This is a poem that evokes Frank Stanford's experience as a young kid between the ages of 5 and 10 going to levee camps because his father was a levee engineer, a very prominent levee engineer. And while he grew up wealthy, in a posh Memphis suburb. They spent their summers living in tents at levee camps, and he encountered all these black characters there. The Blood Brothers. There was born in the camp with 6 toes. He popped the cottonmouth's head off. There was Baby Gage. He tied the line to his wrist. He tied it to the alligator gar. He rode the fish. There was Ray Baby. He stole the white man's gold tooth. He knocked it out with a 2x4. He rode the moon-blind horse. There was Charlie B. Lemon. He had 4 wives and a pair of long-toed shoes. There was Mose Jackson. He threw snake eyes in his sleep. There was Bobo Washington. A rat crawled in the bed and sucked the blood out of his baby's head. There was Jimmy. He had the knife like night. He was white. I had the hands like dragonflies. I killed one white man. He was a midget. I did it with a frog gig. It was the summer of the Chinese daughter. I danced on the levee.
Mm. And wow.
I got chills right now after reading that because it's there's so much going on in this poem, and he captures the fascination he had with these characters who were unlike any other people he had ever seen before.
It is, though, one of the things I find interesting, it's pretty straight ahead in terms of describing these people, and probably a little bit of uh, artistic license about them. But then it's almost like every little section or stanza is just describing another one of these fascinating characters he met. But then I had the hands like dragonflies. I
Yeah.
killed one white man. He was a midget. As far as we know, Frank did not kill anyone.
No. One of the curious motifs running through his poetry is an obsession with, grotesques. And I don't mean to suggest that a midget is necessarily grotesque, but unusual, marginalized, different people. And this midget it appears throughout his poetry, and it's unclear who it's referring to, but it's a really bad relationship that the protagonist has with this midget. But no, Frank never killed a midget.
I did it with Froggy. How would you, if someone, you were just having a casual conversation with someone who didn't know Frank Stanford's poetry at all, and this may not be a fair question, but as someone who's been immersing himself in Stanford and his poetry for 10 years, in in an unfair short span of words, how would you describe Frank Stanford's poetry?
I mean, the first word that comes to mind is raw. It's not. These poems are crafted, but there's a rawness that he left in them. The other is there's just a deep affection and attentiveness to images, to the way people looked, to the way they dressed, to their style. And it was very much a kind of admiration for people who were on the margins, living in the backwoods, not people who were accustomed to having a lot of attention paid to them. And the other thing is just his ear was amazing. Like he could really get accents, the way people talk, the expressions that people used. And you don't see it necessarily so much in this poem, but in the battlefield in particular, you get the sense that here's a guy who paid attention not just to what was said, but how it was said, the accent that was used, the pace in which the language was spoken. And this deep affection for language, which I see as extremely Whitman-esque, is carried into the poetry. And so I think those are some of the defining features of his poems. And the last thing I would mention is there's a kind of omnivory there. Like you will find references to operas, and you will find references to frog gigging and, grilling a goat at a juke joint. And none of it's none of it ever comes off as posing. It's real. It's something that he experienced in one way or another and felt in one way or another. And I think he had a kind of expansiveness to his vision that was, I've never seen anything like it. Like I've never read a writer who had such a range in terms of accents, language, tone, experience, high, low, whatever.
You know, one thing you didn't mention there that, and maybe you're going to disagree with me, I don't know, but when I read Frank's poetry, it may be that these poems have correspondence to actual real experiences. Clearly they do. And he's describing things, etc. And yet he, as much as any poet I've ever read, is creating a new little world. I mean, this book
Oh,
has worlds that he has created in it, and they're kind of fantastic. They're sort of um, incredibly imaginary, and so it could almost feels like this is all just straight out of his imagination, not necessarily corresponding to real world or real experiences, but I think it was.
yeah. I mean, there's no question that there's that kind of Yoknapatawpha Faulkner-esque concentration on these characters that reappear, and that, even more than Faulkner, we do get a kind of fantastical, mythological
Mhm.
cosmos where these characters go about their lives and have really remarkable experiences. Stanford has a really incredible way, though, of taking something that's so common and mythologizing it and
Yeah.
making it fantastical. So it's something as simple as catching a fish,
Yeah.
which, he worked as a fishing guide. This was something that was central to his own experience growing up. He can, in the battlefield, turn that scene into a 25-page, epic old man in the sea
Yeah.
sort of, and truly fantastical scene. So, I mean, there's no question that I don't think Frank did a whole lot of making things up out of whole cloth. I think everything was linked to an image or a person or an experience that he had, but his ability to kind of take it into a fantastic stratosphere was
Yeah.
truly remarkable because that can go wrong so easily. I mean, the closer you stay to your own experience and own autobiographical um, awareness, in some ways, I think the safer ground you're on. But to kind of take the risks that he does, and for it to work is remarkable. And I can't put my finger on what makes that happen, but it's again one of those experiences where you know it when you see it.
Yeah, when you read these poems, you're in the presence of some a brilliant poet who
Yeah.
writes like no one else, really, and he does kind of create his own. Let's read another poem. This one's called in. Let me read this one. It's called Instead. Now this is a little later, though. Is it kind of mid-career? Would you say
Well, okay, so Instead came out in the poem in the book.
1979?
Yeah, so this was published posthumously. Um, I, I'm going to guess that he wrote this towards the end of his life. I can't say for sure. But I mean, he had a huge backlog of poems, and when he put a book together, he sometimes picked poems that he had written years and years ago. But I think this one, for reasons maybe we can talk about after you read it, was very much a kind of poem where he was looking back on his life. But yeah,
All right, so it's called Instead. Death. What a way to start a poem.
yeah,
Death.
get right to
Death
it.
is a good word. It often returns when it is very dark outside and hot, like a fisherman over the limit, without pain, sex, or melancholy. Young as I am, I hold light for this boat. When the rest of you were being children, I became a monk to my own listing imagination. Nights and days floated over the whorehouse like webs on the lake, a monastery full of noise and girls. The moon throws the knives. The poets echo goodbye, towing silence too. Near my house was an island where a horse lathered up alone. Oh, Abednego, he was called, dusky, cruel as a poem to a black gypsy. Sadness and whiskey cost more than friends. I visit prisons, orphanages, joints, hoping I'll see them again. Willows, ice, minnows, no money. You'll have to say it soon, to your wife, your child, yourself. Wow, man. Knives show up a lot in his poems. Um, the moon shows up a lot in his poems. Uh, what is it that we're going to say? You'll have to say it soon, your wife, your
Yeah,
child.
I mean, the reason why I chose this poem is I think it's a poem where Sanford is looking back on his life and, he's feeling like he's lived it. There's this intimation, young as I am, I hold light for this boat being death, and I think he is saying, when the rest of you were being children, this is a Keats quote here, I became a monk to my own listening imagination. So he's channeling the kind of romantic tradition that he deeply identified with. And I think what he's saying there is, I'm going to check out here, but man, I lived it. Don't fool yourself into thinking that I cheated my talent or cheated my skill or my ability. But he's also saying towards the end of his life, I've got nothing, and then you have this really jarring, and he did this shift in the first poem that we read too. In the first poem, we have the shift to the first person. Here we get the shift to the second person. You'll have to say it soon, to your wife, your child, yourself. I think an admission that it's done. You've caught beyond your limit. Anything you do from here is going to have diminishing returns or no returns at all. And in a way, this is its own sort of very kind of blunt romanticism as well. I lived it. It's done. There's no more, and I'm going to check out. And I've been holding this light for this boat long enough, and it's time. I mean, this is how I read the poem, but you're also right to point out that there's another thing in here, which is all the motifs that run throughout his work. Death and the moon and the gypsy and the
Fishing,
biblical reference,
fishing. Yeah.
fishing. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, and there's also a little bit of a shout out to his friends, and he's really talking about the Black community that he hung out with in Fayetteville at Sherman's Tavern. These guys he hung out with were very different from the MFA students he hung out with, who were upwardly mobile literary types. These guys were, Black dudes in Fayetteville who were, doing their best to keep their head above water and hung out at the local bar and swapped stories. And Frank was very much incorporated and welcomed into that group. So he's, prisons and orphanages and joints, hoping I'll see them again, get one more conversation with, Jimbo or Sherman or Claude, his buddies from that bar. So it's really, again, like this is a poem where I think knowing the biography can really lend you a depth of insight into what he's doing here.
Let me ask you about two more moments in the poem that are curious to me. Excuse me. One is a monastery full of noise and girls. What an interesting juxtaposition. When one thinks monastery, one thinks quiet and men, not girls. A monastery full of noise and girls. Any particular thoughts about that one, other than
Well,
it's
I think the monastery he's equating, which is just a signature Stanford move, is he's equating the whorehouse and the monastery. And, over the whorehouse, like webs on the lake, a monastery full of noise and girls. And so I think, obviously you think of a whorehouse, you might think of noise and girls as being something that would go on in a whorehouse, not so much a monastery. However, Stanford got to know the monks at Subiaco very well and came to deeply admire them for, in some ways, their libertinism. I mean, they did enjoy excessive drink, excessive food. They would stay up all night having philosophical conversations. They were impulsive. They could, you want to go out and hang out on the lake all night, they would do it. So I'm not saying that he's directly equating a whorehouse and a monastery in sexual terms, but in terms of the diminishment of barriers and the freedom to be expressive in maybe some subversive ways. Frank's time at the monastery, where he spent a lot of time after he graduated from Subiaco, because his mother continued to work at Subiaco, the boarding school. So he went home there. When he went home to the monastery and became very close to the monks. He was never religious in a traditional sense, but he admired the monks, again, like for their joie de vivre. I mean, for their willingness to kind of really live life. And so I think there's some sort of connection going on with the whorehouse and the noise and the girls there.
Yeah, and Frank was probably just as comfortable in the monastery as he was in the whorehouse. However, am I reading too much, do you think, into this? The whorehouse and the monastery are, the reference here is nights and days floated over these things. Am I reading too much to say it's almost suggesting a lack of true deep connection, that he spent his time in these places, but he was floating above it. He wasn't
I
really.
think that's fair. I mean, this is, I think, you're putting your finger on, I think, a core aspect of Stanford's character, which is that, he never deeply connected with anything.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the sadder moments of my research was the realization that I don't think Frank had a lot of friends and a lot of very good friends, but I don't know that he had soulmate. Like, I don't know that he ever was able to connect in that way where you give enough of yourself to somebody where you're dependent on them, or not just a person, but even an institution where you fully commit. Because I think he was fully committed to his poems.
Right.
And I think that's where it all went. And if that's where you go as an artist, you're going to float everywhere else. So, a lot of people who hung out with Frank said he just didn't seem always there. Like, it always seemed like he was sort of off somewhere else, and he was. And so, again, it's romantic. It's romantic, like, in terms of his artistic life, that's romantic, but it's also tragic. I mean, it's no
Yeah.
way to actually live a well-balanced,
Right.
content
Right.
life.
Because while in the moment, he's already writing a poem about that moment, in
I
effect.
think so. I think he was always in his poetry.
Which
Yeah, that's a great
you find with a lot of artists. And the other comment, or the other thing I wanted to ask you about, what you thought is this line: sadness and whiskey cost more than friends.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'm not. I'm gonna guess he's looking back. This is the reminiscent part of the poem, and he struggled with depression. He struggled with alcohol. Um, and I think those things took much more out of him than the friendships gave him, is how I'm reading that.
yeah. Wow, man, we could talk for hours. We should wrap up, and let's wrap up with this poem, "Flies on Shit."
Yeah, I
It's
mean,
just a
not the most
fascinating
generous
poem.
poem, but I think it reveals, in some ways, a petty and envious and slightly arrogant aspect of his character. And so, this is a poem that is about his experience as an undergraduate being invited to take classes in the MFA program at the University of Arkansas. Truly prestigious program, had some great young poets in there, and Frank came in and stole the show, and was not particularly generous about the other poets and their influence on him in that program. One of the things that Frank, just say one more thing before we read this. One of the things that Frank was really, really important to his self-mythologization was to be uninfluenced, like to be sui generis, to be just, for his poetry to come from some magical place that nobody touched. And he really grated against any suggestion that he was influenced by anybody else. So the notion that he had been shaped or molded by the other super talented poets in this MFA program was when he overcompensated in his rejection of. And that's what this poem is about.
wasn't that program at that time also full of a lot of sort of um, I think I've shared with you that I worked with Leon Stokesbury a little bit back in the 70s, and there was a lot of sort of I don't know, not very friendly, not very nice kind of comments about each other, and maybe some
Yeah, but let's just say that the workshop was not a safe space.
no, definitely
No,
not. Yeah.
no.
Okay. Let's.
The whole point was to take people down,
Yeah,
and Frank never got taken down.
no, no.
Never did. All
He
right.
won. He won, and then committed suicide at 29. So,
Yeah, right.
but do you mind reading this poem?
I'd love to. Flies on shit. To the gentlemen from the South, to the tourists from the North who write poems about the South, to the dumbass students, I'd like to ask one lousy question. Have you ever seen a regatta of flies sail around a pile of shit and then come back and picnic on that shit? Just once in your life, have you heard flies on shit? Because I cut my eye teeth on flies floating in shit.
Mm.
It's not really a characteristic Stanford poem, but
Yeah.
the reason why I chose it is it speaks to this specific moment in his life and highlights again an aspect of his character that's, doesn't evoke a lot of admiration. And I have a fairly lengthy section in my book exploring the retreat he made from this MFA program. And I'm I think it's an important detail to include because this is a remarkable poet who lived a remarkable life, but he was also human and he had flaws. And I think that poem is in some ways an admission. I think it's an open admission that I'm just going to air this grievance and you can do what you want with it.
Yeah. Yeah. James, thank you so much for doing this. Look, I really look forward to reading your book, and it'll be out soon, I know. And I'm also fascinated by your other projects, especially the one on Everett Maddox.
Thank you.
I'm sure, hopefully that won't take you 10 years.
Oh,
Uh,
no, this is going to be a portrait, not a biography. So I'm thinking more of a couple hundred pages. It shouldn't take more than a couple of years. I'm pretty well into it right now. So
well, man, I appreciate you, and thanks for doing this.
thank you, John. I really enjoyed it.
All right, man. Take care.
Take care.